So if I'm lucky, it's got me, but probably it's somewhere up there. It'll be filming for the whole time, so. Oh, was it? Oh, no. You can watch little me or big me. I know what I'd choose. Right. A couple of weeks ago, I was really blessed to be able to go to Loverston. Loverston has just opened its new chapel. It's been rebuilt. It was the second Sunday of its existence of a new chapel. So being really nosy and having preached in the old chapel, I was quite excited to see what it was like. And just in case, for those of you who may not know, Loverston sadly burnt down a few years ago, their beloved sanctuary. Devastating blow for the family there. But they were praying, they were calling on God, meeting in the little Sunday school room. And they felt God saying, no, build a new place and use it for the community as well as yourselves. So they did. Anyway, one of the things that really struck me with the new chapel is that there's a wonderful continuation with the old. So walking in there, it doesn't feel terribly different in some ways. It's still got the character of Loverston. When I was preaching there, it didn't feel like an entirely new building, and yet it's airier, lighter, it's very contemporary, and it's flexible for modern worship and also for community purposes. So it was absolutely superb. If you get a chance to have a look, do check it out because it's beautiful what they've done. I was chatting to Hugh afterwards. Hugh, their organist, he's one of the deacons, and using his professional skills, he oversaw the rebuilding project. And of course, we were chatting about it over tea. He was using lots of helpful layman terms, but telling me about the different processes, the sustainable materials that they brought together, even down to the foundations. As I was driving away from Loverston, then for the next couple of days, it got me thinking about church, both church, the building, and church, the people, the physical and the spiritual. The folks of Loverston had invested incredibly heavily time, prayer, energy, money into rebuilding their beloved chapel. In fact, every church I've ever attended has poured an awful lot of time and effort into beautifying, maintaining, extending their buildings. And I think of all the different church members' meetings I've attended, and I'd say probably over 50% of the majority are focused on the building, health and safety, different policies. And it's part of stewardship, it's necessary. But it got me thinking, do we invest as heavily, or even more heavily, in our spiritual temples as we do our places of worship, our buildings? So I'm always on the lookout for sermon inspiration. I preach about once a month. I'm always afraid that the well is going to run dry, that God won't give me something. And when I find something, I grab it and go, right, Lord, is this for the next church, please? I need some inspiration. And I'm going to share the fruits of that thinking about church as building, as people this morning. And I'm going to try and ground it biblically in the book of Ezra, the reading we heard earlier on. But before I read the text, before I read the text, I've already read the text. I was going to read the text in the middle, you see, but then there was no children's talk. But before we sort of start to unpack the text, I just want to tell a story that I heard years ago in Johnston. It was told as a bit of a beginning for a sermon on Matthew 5, Jesus telling his disciples to build on the rock of his teaching. Well, it works just as well, I think, for Ezra. So it's a story about a place called Long Beach in America in the 1930s. They'd had an earthquake. It was what they'd call a moderately severe earthquake, but it caused far more damage than an earthquake of that magnitude had any right to cause. So the insurance companies, being suspicious people, sent their assessors, they sent their structural engineers to check it out, to see what had gone wrong. And as they were looking at the foundations of the buildings that had collapsed, they discovered that pennies were saved, shortcuts had been taken. There were some slipshod building practices. The foundations weren't good enough, basically. And so when this quake came along, literally, buildings were shook off of these insufficient foundations. So before they could start to rebuild the many damaged places, they had to build proper foundations of them, start from scratch. It's important to have the proper base, the proper foundation, isn't it, for whatever. Our place in Johnston, we've lived there a good few years now, but when we first moved in, I was looking at the survey reports, and apparently we're built on floating foundations. I didn't know there was such a thing, but being former marshland, our floating foundations, and in the years we've lived there, we've seen an awful lot of rain, and we haven't once floated off, so I'm assuming it's the appropriate foundations for the place we're in. So you need a secure foundation, whether that's for a building, whether that's for a fellowship, whether that's for a marriage. And in our passage today in Ezra 3, the challenge I felt coming through it was about building solid foundations for our lives. So we saw two foundations being built, two restoration projects, a physical one and a spiritual one. A temple and a nation's heart. So Israel had slipped off of its foundation about a generation or so before, big time. They hadn't simply started ignoring God, but it was the inevitable moral consequences that were increasing over time. Before they were kicked off the land, they were oppressing the poor and the vulnerable. Their behaviour and their attitudes towards widows, orphaners, foreigners, refugees stank. There was a corrupt justice system. You didn't get justice based on the facts of your case. It was based on the size of your wallet and who you were willing to bribe. And there was even the most awful kind of child abuse. Right from the very king downwards, people were burning babies as a living sacrifice to the god Molech, something that one of the practices among some of the pagan nations, the worst of the pagan nations. And scripture tells us it was done to an even greater level in Jerusalem. So after repeated warnings, God ripped the foundations out from underneath the Jews. This was promised by the prophets, who they killed for being unpatriotic. And foreign armies swept into the land, destroyed everything, and sent the peoples across the Babylonian Empire. Well, of course, this caused some very serious soul-searching among the survivors as they wept their bitter tears, as they grieved for all they'd lost. An event immortalised for us in modern days by Boney M, but I won't sing the first line of that. I'm sure you know it well. But the same prophecies that had warned them to stop their evil, to stop their God rejection, had also promised that later, if they turned back to God, then he would restore them to the land. And history tells us that for a series of miraculous and seemingly impossible God-engineered events, they were brought back to this devastated, broken place. Now, I said impossible because one thing I was interested to find out years ago when I was studying it, I'd always sort of read about the exile of the Jews and then coming back to the land as just something that happens. Great, people always return eventually, don't they? Like people who leave Pembrokeshire, go away and live away for a while, they often tend to come back to Pembrokeshire, like Emma, for instance. But what happened with the Jews coming back was unprecedented. It was extraordinary. Because one of the habits of the empires, like the Babylonian Empire, the Persians after them, and others, they didn't just take over a land and then boss it. They took over a land, they took the majority, and it was always the ones they took were the best, the most talented, the most powerful, the richest, spread them across different countries in the empire. And then the few that were left, the uneducated, the poor, they would backfill with other nations. And so that basically, not only was the territory conquered, but the nation had its identity stolen from it. So within a generation, new children would grow up in new lands with different gods, different cultures, different languages. And they'd lose sense of their original identity. They wouldn't want to go back to the land. And what this meant was old countries that were occupied never rose again. They never became a threat to this current empire. So it was a really fantastic way, I suppose, of utterly destroying and knocking down any resistance for the future, not just the present. So the fact that the Jewish people not only held on to that sense of themselves, but also, for the first time ever in history, they were given permission to go back to the land. They were even given money by Cyrus to start to rebuild the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem. It was extraordinary. And of course, now they're back and they're having to build from scratch because there's nothing there. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had done an excellent job of utterly destroying what was there before. And when you start anew, you start from the foundations up. Now, verses 1 to 7 of Ezra told us about the spiritual foundations, and verses 8 to 13 described the laying. Did I say spiritual at the start? I got it mixed up. Started with the spiritual ones, and 8 to 13 started with the physical temple foundations. And the order's really significant. They started with the spiritual before even laying hand on a shovel. Verses 5 and 6 describe the spiritual worship the people are giving God. Verse 6, although the foundations of the temple of the Lord had not yet been laid. So they didn't wait to build the temple before calling upon the God for whom that temple was for. They didn't wait to start worshipping. They began worshipping before the house of worship was even built. And what that tells us, I think, is that the true foundation of faith, it starts here. It starts at the heart level. And if it isn't, then we might as well rip down every cathedral, every church, every chapel, because without that true foundation, they're just pointless, hollow, pretentious monoliths to an insincere cause. Which was why God allowed the first temple, Solomon's temple, probably the most lavish and beautiful religious building in world history, to be completely decimated and ripped down. The one in the last 9 months since coming here, as I've listened to Terry, and I have listened to Terry, I haven't switched off, but I've also found myself looking around the sanctuary because I like aesthetics, I like buildings. And I find it rather beautiful looking at those windows, looking at some of the plaster work. It's a very beautiful sanctuary. So what I'm going to say next, I mean it in the best possible way. But I would rather this church fell into terminal ruin than for just one soul who attends here fell into terminal spiritual ruin. And I wonder how many Christians across our land spend more time focusing on their buildings, their mortal buildings, than they do very mortal souls. A few years ago, I was doing a funeral service and somebody came up to me afterwards and they said, "Oh, that was a really comforting message, thank you very much." And as a vulnerable minister, as all ministers are, it's nice to get a pat on the back because you always feel you're doing awfully. But then he added the caveat, which surprised me, and this wasn't a church attender. He said, "Well, you're an educated chap. You don't really believe on all that kingdom on earth stuff, do you? You don't really believe that Jesus is going to come back and there's going to be a big trumpet and there'll be his judgment on all that?" Of course, I laughed and I said, "Well, yes." I told him how much I loved my lay-ins and how few I got and how I've given up hundreds, thousands of Sunday morning layings to come to church, and I wouldn't do that unless I believed in the promises that that church stood for. You wouldn't catch me regularly in church unless I believed that I'd encountered the one who died and rose again to make those promises a reality. And I wouldn't waste my life on church. And church takes a lot of effort, doesn't it? A lot of effort, a lot of meetings, a lot of money. We all pour so much time in. I wouldn't pour my time into it unless the foundation of my hope was built on what the church represents, the promise and the good news of Jesus. Has anyone heard of a chap called Simon Boas? No. Well, when I'm getting ready in the mornings, when I'm sort of shaving, I do shave, I just trim it a bit, brushing my teeth and all that, doing my morning ablutions. I normally listen to Radio 4, the Today programme. And quite regularly over the beginning of this year, a chap called Simon Boas was being interviewed. Simon Boas, he died about a month ago, I think. Simon Boas was a chap who at the beginning of the year had a diagnosis of terminal cancer. He wrote a book called The Beginner's Guide to Dying. Sounds horribly depressing, but it was actually a hope-filled book. He said that dying gave him perspective that his life desperately needed. It taught him that status, wealth, possessions didn't have the value he thought they had. But love, relationships, and the hope, these were the things that he wanted to treasure. These were the things that had lasting value. And I think the great sadness is that many of us have to get to the doorstep of death before we get that valuable perspective. But what a wonderful life to live before we have that diagnosis or before we just drop dead, to live in hope every single day, an eternal hope. So that's the first point I want to make this morning. Where are our foundations? Do we have our foundational priorities right? So back to the text and moving on to the second point. Once both foundations have been laid, the people were overcome with emotion. Our emotions are complex, aren't they? Have you ever hugged somebody and you felt both vulnerable and happy at the same time? Love hurts, and it's wonderful. And we're complex creatures. And I think we see this in the Israelite response, this complexity. Some people were praising and celebrating, and this was the most wonderful thing in the world, while at the same time some people were weeping, mourning, grieving. We hear in another book of the Bible, despising what had occurred. So there wasn't just tears of joy at this momentous historic moment, getting back the land, laying the foundations. Why were there tears as well? Well, it's important to note that it's the older priests who are mourning. They remember the glory of the good old days. In Haggai 2:3, another part of the Bible that describes the events going on today, we read they're old enough to remember Solomon's temple and its wonderful trappings and glory, and they despised the day of small things. They didn't like change. They were living in the past. And so they grieved at God's new work as if the people were celebrating and embracing God's new work. Mourning is natural. Letting go of the past is really hard. My nan and granddad lived their whole married lives in a place called Kingsford Village in Northamptonshire. It's my village. Goodings go back to the Doomsday Box, so I'm probably incredibly into bread. But it's a bit of a mixed village. In the centre of the village, there's some beautiful sandstone homes that can cost you the best part of £1 million. But on the outskirts are just normal little terrace cottages and houses that ordinary people live in. And my grandparents, they lived in an ordinary little terraced house, just like many other ones of the same make and model, if you like. But it was a special place to them because that's where Alan, their son, grew up. They had lots of family events and occasions. And so that place symbolised happiness for them and beginnings of their family. In the 1970s, the council decided to knock down their home and the house next to it to build an access room into the road into the centre of the village. Now, nothing was lost really, just another little house bit boring, nothing architecturally interesting. But my nan and granddad wept because it was special to them, special part of their past. So mourning for the past is natural. It can even be helpful. Ecclesiastes tells us there's a time to weep and there's a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. But history, and certainly the history we read today, tells us that it can become selfish also. So in that book of Haggai, I said, we read that the mourners wailed and moaned, despising the new. The reason they despised the new is that they were looking at these new foundations. They knew that they weren't as big as the original foundations. They knew straight away this new temple, the Temple Mark II, was going to be quite small in relation. Now, Solomon had pretty inexhaustible wealth. His father David had spent decades building up all the materials, all the money, the silver, the gold, the cypress wood, everything to build the temple. Solomon had his own big purse to add to that, so no penny was spared. They built this gorgeous temple, and if you ever read some of the descriptions of the temple in the Old Testament, it's extraordinary. Literally dripping with gold and jewels and beautiful carvings. Probably never been paralleled since. They remembered that. Look at these pathetic little cuttings now. And so they despised it. It wasn't as glorious as what they remembered. It was different. And in fact, their mourning was so great, not only did it spoil the celebrations of the celebrators, but we read elsewhere that it discouraged the builders. It set the building work back years. It hindered God's work because the builders lost heart at all the grieving people despising what they were doing. I don't think this was just an issue for those ancient people. I think this is an issue for every generation of believers since. Church historians tell us it certainly is over the last 2,000 years. Yes, the spiritual truths remain the same, but the way we do church, be church, work out church, changes to reflect the society we're in, to make us more accessible to the generations now. And in the face of ongoing change, one commentator writes, we must find ways in the church and in our personal lives to grieve our losses without being mired in the past. A bit of a first-hand experience of this. When we were in Johnston Chapel, so before I went into ministry, we're talking 18, 19 years ago. At that point in Johnston, I was one of the elders, and we were talking about what was the next page in our chapter? What page are we turning next? What does God want for us to do in this next phase? Because we sensed that God was bringing something different. Well, after much prayer, we felt that God was saying, serve your community. Be useful to your community. Make yourselves more accessible. So this fed into members' meetings. We had lots of discussions. And one idea that we suggested was, you know what, we've got this sanctuary. We don't really have a hall, but we've got a sanctuary. However, it's got fixed pews, so it means it's great for a Sunday morning and a Sunday evening, but what do you do in the week? So we said, well, let's get rid of the fixed pews, put down the carpet, and have stackable chairs like downstairs in the hall there, so that you can do things for the community the rest of the week. Well, one lady, a lovely lady, but on this point, her gaze wasn't particularly lovely. She said, over my dead body. Well, we've probably all heard that at various points in church meetings, perhaps. But we continued to pray, we continued to look, and eventually, as a church, we made that decision to get rid of the pews, to refurbish the sanctuary, to have the stackable chairs. And thank God it wasn't over that lady's dead body, so that was a good outcome. But I think this was God's stamp that it was of him. Because shortly afterwards, only weeks afterwards, we heard that the Beavers, the Scouts, the Cubs were losing their home. The church hall for St. Peter's Church down the road was closing. They were going to knock it down for health and safety reasons. They were homeless. They couldn't find a place big enough or cheap enough to house them. And they were talking about moving right out of the area. So we could go to them and say, look, we've now got a building that's suitable for you. Do you want to come and use our sanctuary? Free of charge, all you have to do is pay for damages, and there are a fair few of them because they love their footballs. But it was a wonderful opportunity. And so the Scouts, the Cubs, the Beavers all came to the chapel, and we started to build a bit of a relationship with parents, leaders, kids. They were coming to the Easter services, the Christmas, the special events, the harvest. And Derek Trevette, the minister at the time, it gave him an opportunity for a bit of an informal kind of chaplaincy role. It was what God wanted for that church family at that time. But it involved some really painful change. And for those people who remembered the happiness of growing up in that building, the happy memories of their early faith days, it was brutally hard because it meant significant change. As a church here, I'm sure we're going to face our own change challenges. If we don't, then it means God's given up on us. So I pray we have our own change challenges as a church and as individuals who attend this church. And when God puts them in our path, we'll face the age-old problem. Will we celebrate and embrace this new action of God? Or will we just fold our arms and defiantly gnash our teeth and say, not over our dead bodies? Change is really hard. And we must never, ever look at change for the sake of it. But when God moves, as I pray he does, I also pray, and speaking for myself, that we're not like those change resistors we see in Ezra. But coming back to the start, we can only have a future in Bethesda with whatever change that brings if we've first laid the foundation for it here in our hearts. There are good God ideas. I believe that decision by Johnston at that point in its history was a good God idea. And there are seemingly good ideas. Good God ideas come from a foundation of praise, of getting close to God, getting to hear what he has to say. And seemingly good God ideas, and I had quite a few of these in Pisgah when I was there, came from just wanting to do something useful and so giving it a go, but then sometimes finding that God wasn't really in it. The first foundation layers in our chapter today, they laid the foundation of praise and worship before reaching for their shovels and rolling up their sleeves and doing stuff. So finally, I do pray for God ideas in our church community. I pray for a growing desire in each of our hearts to get closer to God, to get to know him better, to help him, and to let him help us to strengthen our spiritual foundations. And I pray that he gives us the courage and the grace to put aside our own difficulty in whatever change that means, trusting to his future rather than our past. Amen.